reviewing the study article 1919 100 Years Ago from the October 2019 Watchtower Study Edition. This is the JW Review. Hello and welcome to the JW Review. My name is Mike Felker and this is the weekly podcast where we normally examine this week's Watchtower study article and we compare it to what the scriptures teach. The article we're reviewing today is not this week's Watchtower study article. Instead, is one of the introductory articles in this October 2019 Watchtower study edition. I thought it'd be more interesting to go over this article instead of this week's article. So if you have any questions about this week's article, let me know in the comments and I will be happy to share my thoughts on that. So as long as this one doesn't go too long, I will be responding to some of your comments and questions at the very end of this. So this is the 100-year anniversary for 1919. That's very, very interesting. And 1919 is something that I bring up a lot, and the Watchtower also brings up a lot. So I thought it would be very appropriate to go over this particular article. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So this article is essentially a history. A very short history, a very summarized history about what happened with Joseph Rutherford in 1919, and it talks about some of the things that were going on politically with the wars. There's a lot that happened in 1919, and I would say very clearly that 1919, and you could even say 1914, those were very important years, not only for the Jehovah's Witnesses, but just worldwide. So I don't want to diminish the fact that these years are very important years in history, but they're certainly not the only important years in history. There's plenty of other important years in history and dates in history. But the question is, do they have anything to do with Bible prophecy? That's what we want to ask, because you will see all the time the Watchtower talking about 1914 being a pivotal year in world history. And sure, I will be the first one to say that is very, very true. But does it have anything to do with Bible history? That's what we want to ask. And we want to ask the same thing about 1919. What does this year have to do with Bible prophecy? Is there anything in the Bible that would point us to 1919 and say, yes, that is the fulfillment of this particular text? At the only place in this whole article in 1919 where anything about the Bible is mentioned is the very last paragraph. So what I want to do here is go over just a few highlighted points in this article. We could go through the whole article, and I would recommend that you do that. So if you're watching this or listening to this, read this whole article for yourself. And I would also recommend that you look at this article in context and ask yourself whether it's an accurate depiction of what was going on in 1919. So I think that's a very important thing to consider. Because me personally, I don't really trust the Watchtower's accounting of their own history. I think if you read the Proclaimer's book, I think that book was written or published in the early 90s. There's a lot in the Proclaimer's book that just simply either has outright falsehoods or revisions of their history, or it's not showing the full story. So I think you need to really ask those questions when you're looking at Watchtower's accounting of their own history. Are they giving the full, honest truth, or are they just giving the things that make them look good? Very important things to consider. So let's go ahead and just look at a couple of points that I highlighted here. And this is from the second paragraph. And I apologize, I guess I'm not going to be able to give you paragraph numbers because this article doesn't number the paragraphs. So just bear with me, and if you're listening to this, I would say watch the video and you can see where I am quoting this from. So the second paragraph says, "A new era was beginning, but it would not be ushered in by men involved in that peace conference. In 1919, a new era in the preaching work began when Jehovah energized his people to preach as never before." So what they're talking about here is that a new effort of preaching as never before was initiated in 1919. Okay? Now, this is just something they're isolating to Jehovah's Witnesses, because are they really saying that of all people who claim to be Christians worldwide, that the Jehovah's Witnesses preaching efforts were the best or the greatest? And we can even compare that to today. So I would say, well, no. I don't think that Jehovah's Witnesses preaching work can really hold a candle to the preaching work if we're comparing like all of Christian history, right? And what non-Jehovah's Witness Christians have been doing, I don't think it compares. So what they're talking about here is Jehovah's Witnesses, their preaching efforts may have been from there going forward, unlike what they have ever done before. But think about this. The Jehovah's Witnesses had not been around for very long by 1919. So honestly, it's not really saying a whole lot that they started this preaching work that had never been done before. You know, you have a couple of decades of history. It would be one thing. It would be really impressive if they'd been around for hundreds of years and then this ushered in a new preaching work that had never been done before. So it's kind of overstating things a little bit when they say things like this. So going on, a fellow prisoner, A.H. Macmillan, was later recalled that next day. Brother Rutherford knocked on his cell wall and said, "Poke your hand out." Brother Rutherford then handed him a telegram. Macmillan saw the terse message and knew immediately what it meant. The message read, "Rutherford, Wise, Van, Barber, Anderson, Bully, and Spill, Director, First 3 Officers, love to all." This meant that all the directors had been re-elected and that Joseph Rutherford and William Van Amberg had been retained as officers. Thus, Brother Rutherford would continue as president. Now, I think this is really important when you consider what 1919 is supposed to mean theologically. So what was supposed to have happened in 1919 is that Jesus and Jehovah examined all the religions worldwide, especially the Christian religions, the ones who claim to be Christians, and they saw the Jehovah's Witnesses to be the only ones who were faithfully preaching the message, and they appointed the governing body to be the faithful and discreet slave. So this was an appointment by Jesus Christ. But you can read through the articles around this time, and you will not see any indication of an appointment of the governing body as the faithful and discreet slave. Rather, this was a very human process of an appointment by men, from men and to men. There's nothing historically to show that Jesus appointed these men. So I just want you to know that if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses and you're watching this, and I know there are some of you who are, just think about this. Look at the history and see if you can find any indication of an appointment by Jesus Christ. I don't think you do. But the brothers at headquarters could not just resume the work that they had been doing for years. Why not? Because during their imprisonment, all the printing plates that were used to print literature had been destroyed. This was discouraging, and some brothers wondered if the preaching work was finished. I think if you found something similar happening today, let's say if JW.org crashed and the printing presses crashed, you would have Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide wondering, oh man, is this going to continue? Are we over? What's going on? This just shows you the dependence on the organization for the preaching work. I don't think any Christian any faithful Christian should be, I wouldn't say shouldn't be discouraged, but they shouldn't be wondering if preaching could continue if the literature was destroyed or the printing stopped or something like that. And why? Why shouldn't you lose hope? Well, because you have the Bible. If you're so dependent on non-biblical literature to where you wonder if preaching work can continue if your religion is finished because the printing of non-biblical literature stopped, I think you've got a problem. In the first century church, think about this. They weren't going around, as far as I know, passing around non-biblical literature. No, they were concerned with the message, the verbal message. They were preaching the good news. That's what they were doing. Yeah, sure, Paul's letters and all that, those were being distributed, but those were scriptures. So I just want you to think about this, how dependent the organization is on the publications, because they can be discouraged. That's understandable to be discouraged, but that shouldn't have anything to do with stopping your preaching work, because you have the Bible. You have the Bible, you have the message. Bibles were still around. There was no ceasing of printing Bibles. The New World Translation wasn't even around at this time in 1919. So that if they were really true Christians, that shouldn't have mattered. If they were really getting their message from the Bible, then stopping the literature shouldn't have really mattered. They should have just been able to continue on with the Bible in their hand and preaching the same message that they were preaching. But no, they had a different message, and that's why they needed the literature. They were dependent on the literature, just like they are today. On September 5th, 1919, the fifth day of the convention, in his address to co-laborers, Brother Rutherford announced the publication of a new magazine entitled The Golden Age. It would carry the current news of importance, giving a scriptural explanation as to why these great events were transpiring. So keep this in mind. When these publications were made, Jesus was approving of this organization because of the messages they were preaching. So I would just challenge you, if you are watching or listening to this and you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses faithful to the organization, go find these articles and publications that were around in 1919 and read them for yourself. And ask yourself, would you be continuing today to distribute this literature to people and proclaiming that same message? Or let's just put it this way, go find the finished mystery. Go find the finished mystery, read it for yourself, and ask yourself, would you be okay with proclaiming the same message from those publications that the Jehovah's Witnesses were preaching back in 1919? Would you be comfortable doing that today? And would Jehovah approve of that message today? Well, no, because that's old light and you now have new light. Well, that's precisely my point, because Jehovah approved of that message. So if he approved it back then, why wouldn't he approve it today? Has Jehovah changed? What's going on here? So I think what they're doing here is they're just kind of whitewashing history. They're not expecting Jehovah's Witnesses to go back and look at these publications from 1919. They're not expecting you to do that. And they certainly don't want you to believe the messages from 1919. No, they do not want you to do that. Because if you did do that, I think you would be a little bit disturbed by what you read, or at the very least, you would be finding yourself to be disagreeing with what you read back in 1919. But just remember, Jesus approved that message. Jesus approved that message. And I heard this on another podcast. I think it was the Critical Thinkers podcast, and they brought up a good point that I just hadn't really thought of. And they were just kind of asking the question, would a Jehovah's Witness be comfortable risking their lives with the message that was preached back then in those days? Because Back then, Jehovah's Witnesses either risked their lives or they risked their well-being because they could be imprisoned, right? There were certain instances where Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned because of the messages that they were preaching, whether it was in the United States or other parts of the world. Would you, today as a Jehovah's Witness, put yourself back in time in those days, and would you risk your life or your well-being for the same message that was pronounced in the literature that those back then were providing to people? I don't think you would, because you think the message that they were preaching back then was false. And if you want to question me on that, again, go read the articles for yourself that were published back in 1919. I don't think you would preach that same message, because you have a very different message that you are preaching today. I don't think that is in question at all. The last paragraph, here's where we get into some theology. By the end of 1919, Jehovah's people were reorganized and energized. Additionally, several important prophecies involving the last days had been fulfilled. The testing and refinements of God's people foretold at Malachi 3:1-4 was complete. Jehovah's people had been released from their symbolic captivity to Babylon the Great, and Jesus had appointed the faithful and discreet slave. Now the Bible students were ready for the work that Jehovah had in store for them. I shouldn't be surprised at this, but I was surprised that by the end of this article, they say this. And if you go read the verses, they have nothing to do with what was described in this article. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses are just going to think it does. They're going to see this. They're going to see Malachi 3:1-4. And they're just going to assume that everything applies. But let's go read just Malachi 3:1-4 and see if it has anything to do with Rutherford's imprisonment or any of these things about the preaching work. Let's just see if it has anything to do with any of that. Malachi 3:1. Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says Jehovah of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? And who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. He will sit as a smelter and purifier of silver, and he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, so that they may present to Jehovah offerings in righteousness. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to Jehovah, as in the days of old and as in former years. What does that have to do with anything that was described in this article? Well, what they're going to say is that, well, the Lord came down, he inspected all the religions, and he saw Jehovah's people, and he purified them, and they abandoned their false beliefs, and now they're believing what is true. That's generally the explanation of this. And of course, Jesus then appointed the governing body as the faithful slave. So that's generally the Jehovah's Witness understanding of this passage. Well, is that really the case? Well, no. Look at the very first verse here. Behold, I am going to send my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. Well, what is this about? Well, the best way sometimes to understand a Bible verse is to interpret Scripture with Scripture. And we have a very explicit identification of the fulfillment of this verse. And what is that? Well, let's go to Mark chapter 1. It says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And then Mark explains the fulfillment of this. John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. This in Malachi is a prophecy of the coming of John the Baptist, who prepares the coming of Jehovah, which is the coming of Jesus. And this isn't the only place where this is interpreted for us. So let's look at Matthew 11, verse 10. It said, "This is the one about whom it is written, Behold, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you." Who is it talking about? "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist." It's a prophecy of John the Baptist. So here's the thing. The Watchtower is going to say, well, yeah, that was the first fulfillment, but the 1919 is the greater fulfillment. Think about that very carefully. What they're saying here is the Watchtower is, or the governing body is the greater fulfillment of John the Baptist and the preparing of the way of Jesus. How can you say that the organization, the Watchtower, the governing body is the greater fulfillment of the coming of the Messiah? That's what you're saying if you're saying that this is a dual fulfillment. And I think that is a problem. And look at what this says here. "Among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist." That's what Matthew 11:11 says, which is basically precluding a greater fulfillment. There cannot be a greater fulfillment of this passage because there can't be anyone greater who was born among men, John the Baptist. And of course, the coming of Jesus Christ, there's no one greater than these two men. This is the final revelation of Jehovah, what you have in Jesus Christ. And that's what Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 2 is telling us. It's the final word. There is no greater fulfillment of these verses. Yet, the Watchtower wants to tell us in this paragraph that this is the fulfillment of Matthew chapter 3. It's just so underwhelming when you consider the history here in 1919 that you have a very small religion and you have an imprisonment of a few men who are imprisoned and they are released. And the Watchtower wants to blow this up to make this huge thing. But it's really not when you consider the whole history of Christian persecution. This is like such a minor thing. It's so underwhelming when you read this article and just think about what it's saying. And to think that that is a fulfillment of Malachi chapter 3, 1 through 4. But what about the release of captivity to Babylon the Great? Well, this is where they're saying that the release is where they abandon their ties to paganism, right? They abandon their ties to Babylon the Great, and now they're starting in this new trajectory. But this is really just historic revisionism, because you don't find any indication in 1919 where Jehovah's Witnesses were abandoning all these beliefs that they had once held. Now, it would be really interesting if you had found in 1919 that they had abandoned all these things that they now think are false, and they're now following the truth, and they're going in this new direction. You don't really see much of that. You might find a greater emphasis on the preaching work, but you don't find a whole new message. In fact, in this time, they were still celebrating Christmas, right? They were still involved in what they consider to be pagan holidays. So you don't really find this exiting of Babylon the Great, right? But even what's more important than all of this, they didn't even really understand that they had been appointed by Jesus Christ as the faithful and discreet slave, which is supposed to be only the governing body. That wasn't realized until almost 100 years later. I think it was in 2013 where you have the new light, where they no longer thought it was the entire group of 144,000 that was a faithful slave. And then in 2013, it would just be the governing body. So you have this appointment that supposedly happened to a small group of men, which wasn't even the governing body at the time. You had Judge Rutherford. not a governing body who was ruling this organization. So you just find this historic revisionism that I think is really deceptive. They need to be honest about their history. And how can you follow an organization that is not honest about their history? They need to share the good, the bad, and the ugly, and just come out as honest about it. When you see Christians recounting their own history, we share the good and the bad and the ugly, right? There is a lot of really bad things that happened in Christian history, and Christians have no problem in sharing all of that stuff, right? And the thing is, we're not following men. We're following Jesus Christ. So we have no problem with talking about the honest truth about our history. There's some really bad things that men did in history, right? I admire John Calvin greatly. But I am the first to admit that if I had lived in Geneva when John Calvin was there, he probably would have run me out of Geneva because of the things that I believe. And I'm honest about that. That's fine, okay? That is just the honest truth about our history. So I think you need to learn something if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, that your organization is not always telling you the full story. So question these things. So that's the end of this article, and let's go through some comments. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just going to share with you some of the comments and the questions. So S. Mitchell writes, I have recently come upon preterism and it makes sense. But at what point are we at in Revelation right now? I am confused. So the confusion is very understandable because eschatology is complex. There's so many different perspectives. But generally speaking, the preterist understanding is that most of the book of Revelation happened in the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So where are we at right now in all of that? Well, the preterists would say most of that has been fulfilled, but what we're waiting on is the final return of Jesus Christ and the final resurrection. Those are the main things that we're waiting on. So that would basically mean that the end of Revelation chapter 20, when you find that great battle happening, where Satan and his minions and all of the unbelievers, they're finally brought into judgment by God. So we're waiting on that great war to happen and for God to issue his final judgment and for the resurrection to occur, which basically brings out the creation of the new heavens and the new earth. So those particular events in Revelation, those are the only things, according to the preterist understanding, that we're waiting on right now. I would say that would bring up a lot of questions. I don't have all of the answers, but if you do have any particular questions about that, let me know, because there's a lot of things in the book of Revelation that are, from any perspective, very difficult to explain and understand. You have the two witnesses. I think that's in Revelation 11, if I'm not mistaken. You have that, and regardless of the position you hold to, that's a pretty difficult passage to make sense of. And I cannot say I have that passage figured out by any stretch. So hopefully that short answer was helpful to you. And some of these I've already answered in writing. So if you want to see my answer in writing, you can go to those videos and check that out. So let's go on to some other questions and comments. So Hez0 writes, just wanted to let you know that I appreciate your reviews. I've only seen a few. I've been attending a congregation since April, and it's nice to be able to hear some questioning coming from someone other than myself. I don't feel too comfortable questioning things after meetings, although I try to throw in a pearl here or there to see where people are at. I haven't found a single person who questions what they're fed. It can be a little disheartening being the only one, but I'm thankful for it because it forces me to surrender and strengthens my relationship with Him. I try not to think too much about what God's will is for me. I just wait and see what He has in store for me. So Hez0, I'd say that you are not alone, even if it seems like you're alone. A lot of people who are faithful Jehovah's Witnesses are still, they're going through the motions, and they may be questioning things just like you are, but think about what's at stake for them. If they are coming out and sharing with you their doubts, then that could get them in trouble. They could find themselves before a judicial committee, right? And I'm not sure if you're a baptized Jehovah's Witness, but if you are, you might find yourself in a pretty difficult situation if you are too loud with your comments. But you're in a little bit of a safer spot if you're not baptized. Just know that if you do become baptized, you could find yourself getting shunned, where everyone who is a friend or a family in the congregation, they will no longer speak to you again if you choose to question the religion too much, which could lead you to get disfellowshipped, and those relationships are cut off really for the rest of your life. But a little bit of a different scenario, a little safer of a scenario if you are not baptized. However, they could still do shunning if they choose to, if you choose to leave the religion. I've heard about that happening. So just be careful there. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any specific questions. But keep doing what you're doing, keep questioning, and compare what the Watchtower teaches to what the Scriptures teach. Pro One Theologist says, and thank you, Pro One Theologist, for all your comments. I do appreciate it. And let's see, I do not think believers go through the tribulation, at least the second half. What is your brief take on this? Thanks, brilliant presentation. Well, thank you for the question. So I agree with you that believers don't go through the Great Tribulation. But I also don't think the tribulation is in our future, at least not the Great Tribulation, or what's spoken about in Matthew 24. The reason I don't think that believers went through the Great Tribulation is because as Jesus commanded them to flee, to don't stick around, right? And so they didn't go through the Great Tribulation because they obeyed Jesus to flee, because destruction was coming to Jerusalem. So they were around in the first century for the destruction, but they didn't have to go through all of that. But what I will say is that they did go through a lot of tribulation. Look at what Nero did. Nero issued some just incredibly torturous persecution of the Christians. In fact, history tells us that he used burning Christians to light up his garden at night, right? I mean, just terrible, terrible things that happened. So there was certainly persecution and tribulation. But as far as like the destruction of Jerusalem prophesied by Jesus, Matthew 24, the Christians obeyed Jesus and they fled. So sort of yes and no. I think believers back then went through tribulation, but maybe not the final end of it with the destruction of the temple. So I don't think that the tribulation is a future thing, because I hold the preterist position. So let's go through maybe one or two more. Actually, let's go ahead and wrap up there. Yeah, some of these comments are from older. I don't want to go much past a week ago from some of these comments. So if you have comments, if I have time at the end of these videos, if they're not too long, I may go through some of these. And also, if you want to have a phone conversation, some of you have been writing me via email personally. If you want to do that, go to michaeljfelker.com. Click on the Contact Me tab, and you can send me a message there, and I will respond to you personally. But if you want to arrange a phone conversation, I'm more than happy to do that. Just let me know and we can set up a time to do that. So don't forget to subscribe these videos. That really helps get the word out. The more you that like these, I think YouTube will put these higher on the list. So if you want to share this with others, that's one of the best ways to do that. Even if you don't listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, please go there and rate and review this. Again, that also helps to get the word out. So thank you so much, all of you who support this, who watch this, who comment on this. It's just really nice to know there is a whole community of people who are finding these reviews to be very helpful. So you are the driving force behind this. So as long as you all are watching this and listening to this and commenting on this, I will continue to do these reviews. So with that, hope you all have a great week, and I look forward to next week's review. Thank you so much. For more information about Jehovah's Witnesses and other topics, please visit michaeljfelker.com. There you can also reach me directly to submit questions or comments to be covered on the JW Review. To subscribe to this podcast, please go to iTunes and search for the JW Review.